Our topic today, which is transgender justice, I want to close with a reading that one of our panelists, Reverend Barb, shared with me. It's called No Harm, a Protection Spell by Richael Faithful in a collection called the Black Trans Prayer Book. Loving beings who surround me and inside me, as I go on my way, I need your reflection to invite the kindness of kindred, to attract genuine care, to welcome radical hospitality. I need your force to send back viciousness from its source, to resist confusion of cowardice, to reject hate before it originates. In return, I offer you all of my excellence. I am only visible to rightness and beloveds. May I move with power today. It is so. Thanks, Barb. And before I introduce our panel, I want to name a sadness that our late colleague, Rev. Ian Stanford, is not here with us today. As many of you know, Ian was a longtime friend and colleague of mine and also of one of our speakers, Reverend Cameron Partridge. Ian was a transgender Episcopal priest who was smart, fierce, and loving, and who joined this cohort a couple of years before his death in 2023 from cancer. I know that Ian is with us in spirit right now, encouraging us to lean in, to listen deeply, and to allow ourselves to be transformed by the sharing of truths and life experiences different from our own. I'll never forget the vigil that some of you here organized at the Redwood City Library right after Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022. Batya, you were one of the organizers. Ian spoke prophetically that evening about the impacts of the Dobbs decision on trans and non-binary people for whom reproductive rights are essential in order to become parents. He also told the crowd, and I love this, that many of us liberal and progressive religious people have to stop being so damn polite. Right? He was quoted on that one in the paper. I'm glad they got that. And start speaking truth to power on critical justice issues. So amen, Ian. Rest in power. We miss you. And transgender justice is indeed a critical justice issue. As I think we all know and we'll hear more of today, there has been an explosion of anti-trans legislation across the country over the past several years. Bills that span a wide range of categories, including education, healthcare, sports, performance entertainment, bathrooms, incarceration, and more, which just shows how pervasive and far-reaching the assault on transgender people and their families is right now. And although we live in a blue state and a relatively liberal Bay Area community, we aren't immune from the kind of discrimination that we are seeing elsewhere. And our trans community members are deeply impacted by the recent surge of anti-trans rhetoric and policies. So we are very fortunate to be here today to learn from our panelists and to discover together what we can do to promote safety, dignity, access, and equity for transgender people and their families within and beyond our religious communities. And so now I am delighted to introduce our panelists. Reverend Dr. Cameron Partridge, who I've known for many decades now, because Ian and I were in the Religion, Gender, Culture doctoral program together in the dark ages back at Harvard a long time ago. So delighted he's here. Reverend Cameron is a theologian and rector of St Aidan's Episcopal Church in San Francisco, and he was the first transgender priest to preach at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And so I had to just brag about him that way. Because he wouldn't have said it, but, welcome, Cameron. So Reverend Mr. Barb Grieve is a fellow Unitarian Universalist minister who I was thrilled to discover actually goes way back with Cameron as well, so small world. Yeah, some worlds are smaller than others, right? Reverend Barb currently serves as a hospice chaplain, as we heard, with Kaiser, And he was co-moderator. He probably wouldn't have shared this either, but I'll brag about him. He is co-moderator of the UUA, which is basically the UU denomination, so big national leadership role, and a founding member of the Transgender Unitarian Universalists Together. And Barb's chapter, I highly recommend, called Pastoral Care with Transgender People, is in the book Injustice and the Care of Souls. I hope you have seen this book, Taking Oppression Seriously in Pastoral Care. Came out in 2023. Welcome, Barb. And Ishani Duggar, who uses they and Z pronouns, is the lead trainer and peer group coordinator at our own San Mateo County Pride Center. Ishani provides sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression trainings and peer support for the LGBTQIA+ community. And we're so glad that Ishani could be here with us today to share kind of really grounded local resources as well for us here in the county. And there are materials on the table. Welcome, Ishani. So we'll turn it over now to our panelists, and after the panel, we will have time for questions and discussion, with which Penny will lead. So you can take a seat up here, please. And Ishani, if you want to stand here while you do your slides, whatever is most comfortable for you.
Well, I'm going to aim this seat so that I'm not doing it.
Okay.
Perfect. Me.
Okay, slides.
Yes. Cool. I think I can also probably. Okay. I appreciate that. Yeah. I'm definitely going to be thrown to you. So. All right. Good morning, y'all. Thank you for having me. I will also just throw out one other thing that today is, if folks don't know, today is Spirit Day, which is actually a national day that was started by queer high schoolers to wear purple and celebrate queer identity. That's why I'm in purple today. And anybody else who happens to be? Okay, cool, great. Okay. I promised I'd keep this to a tight 10 minutes, and that's already falling apart. Very briefly, who I work with, the San Mateo County Pride Center. There's a lot of information on screen. There are pamphlets on your tables. So the pamphlets have all of that information. Those are for you all to take as well and share with your communities. Just the two quick things I want to highlight about the Pride Center. Our website is sanmateopride.org. All of our information is there. And we are a physical community center that is open to the public. Folks of all identities are welcome to come visit us, engage with us, use our resources, and we are a 5-minute drive that way. So we are very close by. So please come hang out with us, visit us, all of those things. And if you have specific questions about what we do, ask me. All right. There we go. So very briefly, I just want to kind of give a little bit of the lay of the land about kind of the trans community and the trans community and religion, just so that can hopefully ground us a little bit in our discussion. So one of the things that I personally found a little bit surprising, because of the lot of just anecdotal, I would say, stories within queer community and outside of queer community, about half of U.S. queer adults are actually religious. There is a very, very large population of religious LGBTQ+ folks, and I will just share anecdotally, having worked with young folks for most of my career, a lot of queer folks who are coming into their queer identity don't want to abandon their religious identity. They want to hold on to that. They want to hold on to their community. They just struggle sometimes to reconcile those two identities, and getting support from faith leaders is really key to allowing them to continue to maintain the whole authenticity of who they are, instead of feeling like they have to leave part of who they are behind. There is a little bit of a higher concentration in certain areas. The Pew Research, who provided this information, did find that a lot of folks who are identify as LGBTQ+ religious adults are located in the South. There's a little bit more folks in like the South of the U.S. than the West, I think was the main comparison. But overall, the queer religious population is out there, and they're looking for community support, things like that. That being said, There isn't always acceptance in return. I will note these are very specifically certain denominations. This is not all religions or religious leaders, but Pew Research also found that over time, for trans folks specifically, there's just been less acceptance from specifically evangelical and some Catholic denominations. You can kind of see that in these slides, and these will be available after if folks want to look more closely. But on the left, it's just showing that from 2017 to 2022, there's actually been an increase of folks who say that gender is determined by your sex assigned at birth, as opposed to gender is an internal identity that is shaped by who you are. That dark blue is sex is determined, and the light blue is sex is different on the left graphic. And then on the right graphic, this is just a more specific breakdown of, again, certain denominations, but specifically, white evangelicals say religion has a great deal of influence on their views about gender and sex. Again, this is not all religious communities, but I do think that this adds to part of the narrative both within the queer community and outside of it, right? That religion is automatically unaccepting, which we all know is not true. But unfortunately, we do have to battle this misinformation as well as part of the work that we do. Oops, sorry, backwards. In that vein, this is correlation, not causation. Y'all can draw your own conclusions. But we've also been seeing a spike in anti-LGBTQ+ bills, laws, things like that. In general, this is a breakdown of just kind of state level legislation regarding LGBTQ+ identities across the board. The interesting thing to me is our right to graphic, sexual orientation and gender identity. You can see that negative laws around gender identity are much, much higher than negative laws around sexual orientation. There's less general protection for gender identity than there is for sexual orientation. So there is a little bit of a split within the community about how folks tend to be treated, with trans folks being a little bit more vulnerable to legislation, as we are seeing in this cycle. And that has obviously, the previous data was from 2020. This is 2023, so 3 years later. One of the big things that is happening is not only are trans folks being targeted, trans youth are specifically being targeted. So a lot of the laws and bills that are being passed are focused on schools, are focused on healthcare for young folks, are focused on sports, but very often like school level sports and college level sports, not only professional, right? And then there are certain states that have been a little more aggressive than others, obviously. But as mentioned, right, LGBTQ+ community is universally connected. Even our trans community that is here and has like laws and protections that are for them, they have friends, family members and loved ones in situations where they are being targeted. And that does still impact kind of who they are, how they see and understand their identity, and how they feel supported or not. This is a lot of focus on what is actually relatively a small part of our population. Overall, in terms of 18-plus-year-olds, about 1.6% of the population is trans or non-binary, with a higher concentration under 30. I didn't include this graphic. The CDC just released a report. They found in 2023, 3% of US high schoolers identified as trans or non-binary, and 2% identified as questioning or unsure of their gender. So 5% of high schoolers have some questions about gender. So I do expect this number to go up. And again, this is the 18-plus population. That being said, obviously 1.6% of the population heavily targeted. We're also out there. We're everywhere. Almost half of the US population personally know someone who's trans. And this significantly is, another way to phrase it, almost half of the US population has a trans person who is out in their lives. Just because you don't know somebody is trans doesn't mean you don't know a trans person, right? So this is also a little bit of a safety statement. Half of US adults, about half, have had a trans person come out to them. And then there's a breakdown in terms of a quarter of them are trans friends, 13% are coworkers, 10% are family members, and then 9% are folks younger than 18. So this is all like the stats, right? One of the big things that, and we're gonna talk about this obviously, just general kind of how to support and be an ally. There's some quick and easy do's and don'ts, and these slides can be shared later. I don't wanna suck up a bunch of time. But the big thing that I do wanna just highlight with the slides that I brought, there's more than one way to be an ally. We're gonna dive into that, so I'm not gonna belabor it too much, but a lot of times people are like, how do I support trans folks? I'm not really sure where to start. anywhere and everywhere is a good place to start, so long as you're being supportive. Education is great. Donations, not just monetarily, but of time and support are really good. Uplifting trans voices, communities, and just the presence of trans folks, even if you don't know that there's a trans person in the room, acting like there might be, not a bad idea. And using our voices, which I think probably segues us very decently into our panel conversation. So I will leave this here. It can just be sitting in the background unless we want to turn on the TV. And if we want to all kind of congregate. Of course. Sorry. Had to do the boring part first.
Not boring. Not boring. Yeah. And it reminded me, I was in a conversation this morning with another national trans leader, and I was reminded that in 2020, the national Christianity, if you will, the conservative, let's return to making this a Christian nation, put more than $300 million into study groups in order to figure out what would play best to their base around everything. And that's how we ended up with the target of trans youth in all of what Shani just shared with us. So I'd forgotten, or I'd blocked out, or, self-survival I ignored. But we did the math, and just to, $300 million put towards this. That's more than the top 3 national trans advocacy groups' budgets combined. That's all I have. All right, maybe not. No. Yeah, no. But it reminds us, right, of both how strong the conservative voice is and how important it is that our collective voices are a religious voice countering that message. And it reminds me that trans youth and the issues around being a trans youth isn't the only part of the conversation, it's just the public part of the conversation. And to that aspect, I'm just going to share with you a personal story to help us remember how complicated it gets. One of the pieces that we forget about is around healthcare, and we think when health insurance companies or health programs say they will or won't cover trans-related healthcare, we often think, oh, that's about the trans body being changed, right? We're talking about surgeries and hormones and et cetera, et cetera. But it also means, depending on who's interpreting the billing, it can also mean the basic care. Several years ago, I ended up with an allergic reaction to a medication. I went to the emergency department and was obviously taken care of because I'm here to talk with you. But I got the bill, and I was expected to pay the entire bill with no copay or insurance help because the insurance policy said that they wouldn't cover trans-related care. And the interpretation was any care to my trans body was trans-related care. Total discrimination, and also yet one more fight trans bodies have to go through for the basics of healthcare. So when we talk about youth and whether or not they can transition in school, whether or not they can play the sports of the gender of their identity, we're also talking about the secretive stuff that those study groups decided wouldn't be helpful to bring into the light. So again, that's where we have to keep the conversation complexified.
Yeah, it's so sobering. I really appreciated that you, Shani, were lifting up that queer folk and trans folk as a smaller slice within the larger LGBTQIA community are people of faith. And there's this narrative that tends to create a binary of faith communities, faith positions, and queer people and trans people. As if they can't ever overlap. And we know that's not true, but it helps to really see statistics in the way that you showed them. So thank you, I really appreciate that. And we do indeed have trans folks in our communities, trans and non-binary folks. And we may or may not know that, and they may be adults, they may be youth, we may have both, and we may or may not know that. And so acting in a way, or practicing and creating spaces of welcome and recognition that just assume that and create that welcome by that assumption are so key. So I'd be curious to hear various ways we've experienced that. And they also, I think at the start, we need to remember that they don't have to always be flawless. Like, you may mess up, and the important thing is to apologize if necessary, or keep going and correct, but don't get so binary in your own sense of needed perfection that you feel overwhelmed from the start. Create that space of welcome, and something that you can do is recognize and reflect and respect people's names and pronouns. You can create a culture of actively sharing your pronouns, as we've done this morning. You can do it in your community of faith. And it might be awkward, okay? And you might not always remember. And generationally, there's different levels of comfort around that, or like experience with that. And that's okay, but just start doing it. And we haven't always done it where I am at St. Aidan's, but it is something that we have started to do. And we are not perfect. I forget to share my pronouns, and I do it at the announcements. I mean, you would figure out in your setting what's appropriate to your setting. But for us, when we make announcements, kind of in the middle of our service, I always try to lead it off by saying my name and my pronouns. Even if I look out there and I know everybody, I know that the people I'm interacting with know my pronouns, and it feels weird and awkward, but I do it anyway, just in case, just to create this sense that you don't necessarily always know what someone's pronouns will be, and to create a space that allows, it invites people to share what that is, so that we can be respectful of one another. For me, there's a theology of that practice, and it is a theology of the human person that is expansive, and that respects the mystery of humanity and the ways that we disclose that mystery to one another as we make our way in the world. So it's like a little practice that can sound like, what does that have to do with anybody's faith community? But actually, it can have quite a lot to do with it. So I just wanted to offer that as, what are the practices that we might take up in our settings that can really be expansively welcoming and fully recognize the dignity of the unfolding humanity we're so blessed to be in the company of. So that's an initial thought.
And I'll add to that, back before I was a hospice chaplain, I served congregations, and part of my job, right, was to tell the story for all ages every Sunday, or almost every Sunday. And I started using non-gendered pronouns, or they, them, for the characters in the story in the places where gender was not important to the storytelling. And it was amazing. In the beginning, of course, almost all the elders and a few of the middle-aged folks were like, what? I can't follow the story. There's too many of the same pronoun. And within a couple of months, if I used specifically he or she in my storytelling, folks would be like, are you feeling okay? You use those pronouns. And so it took some practice on my part. It takes some practice on our part, but I think the more we can do that, the more we can degender or expand the gender, use all kinds of different pronouns for the storytelling, the more we get people accustomed to hearing different pronouns as normal, right? And it's just about that getting used to piece. But you can have a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, and I really like the conversation about practices, right, to make our congregations, our communities more inclusive. And I appreciate what you were saying about I share my pronouns even when everybody in the room knows them, because people will share their experiences, right? And so maybe somebody in that space has somebody in their life who's seeking faith support, but wants a space that feels inclusive, and knowing that this is a space where the person who's leading it shares pronouns and encourages other people too, will help them initially get through the door. And I think if we're thinking about youth, but I think this is also true for adults, right? A lot of queer folks, a lot of folks with marginalized identities in general, and a lot of trans folks, when they're stepping into unknown spaces, they're kind of always like, all right, I need to figure out the lay of the land before I know how I'm going to be able to show up. And offering that off the bat of this is a congregation that does ask for and respects pronouns. This is a space where the stories are not just about cis or straight folks, or this is a space where maybe you can find a faith leader who will listen to you as you instead of like trying to interpret your experiences through their own lens, will allow folks to more readily access these spaces that they do want to. I just think, because there's a lot of narratives both within the queer community. I will also cop to, like, the queer community does perpetuate this. There is a lot of narratives of being queer and being religious can't go together, and that's deeply untrue. But I think one of the reasons that pops up is folks who are in transition around their identity become uncertain about how they're going to be received. So that ability to constantly kind of put out welcoming signs is really important, even if no one new is there to directly witness them, because they will travel down the communication chain. And then I also want to echo, mistakes happen. That's totally fine. Embrace them. My job is to do training and education. I still make mistakes all the time. I still misgender people. That's not, making mistakes does not mean that you are not being inclusive or being supportive. It's just part of the learning and changing and growing process. And trans community members will make the same mistakes. So that's not something that should impede. Leaning into that discomfort to encourage the growth is really helpful.
I was thinking as you were saying that, how we recover from those mistakes matters, right? If we make a big deal out of missing somebody's pronoun and we make it as if their pronoun is the problem, then we're modeling for our communities bad relationships. But if we just go, oh, I'm so sorry, I got your pronoun wrong, and move forward from there, we're modeling that mistakes are normal, and also we can honor one another. And then you said signs, and I went literal. Right? I think concrete sometimes. And I was like, how many of you in your communities have specific signs that say queer folk are welcome here in whatever languaging you want? You know, how many times, or in the beginning of worship services, are you saying explicitly the queer community is welcome here? And are you doing it consistently, or is it only on Gay Pride Sunday or Saturday, right? So those things matter too. A lot of what we do in congregational life and community life is about modeling proactive support, not just assumed support.
So I brought, I brought something that was written by our friend Ian, who was part of this cohort. Ian was a really good friend of mine, as Tovis said, for like 20 plus years. And I wanted to share a little bit of a snippet from this with you all, because I've been thinking about what it's like to be a trans person of faith in contexts where our communities are coming together, and how that can it can be so empowering when they can seamlessly come together, but there can be there's part of the dynamic of being full-throatedly supportive of trans and non-binary folk from faith communal perspectives. There's a dynamic that I think would be helpful for everyone to be aware of, that Ian names in this piece. So this is from 2012, and this was at Boston's Trans Day of Remembrance, which takes place on November 20th annually, a space to come together and recognize and observe a space of memory and of collective empowerment and pushing back against anti-trans violence. And it names folks who have died particularly in the previous year from anti-trans violence. So it's a really hard day, and it's a really important day. And it is one of the earliest kind of national and even international, early on, days that brings the trans community together. So further opportunities for coming together, not focused around violence, have importantly emerged since then. But the day sort of started from a murder that took place in Alston, Brighton, a mile away from the parish that I first served. the TDOR in Boston has taken place in a number of different faith communities over the years. It actually, at the 10th anniversary of the death of Rita Hester, the local Boston community asked if my parish would be the site of that year's TDOR. And I was really moved, incredibly moved. And so we hosted Boston's TDOR that year and the next year. But then the congregation closed, and it needed to move to another space. And it went to the cathedral of my diocese, the Cathedral Church of St. Paul. And so in 2012, I guess that was maybe the third year it was there, Ian, who was a member of a community based out of there, was helping to host. And so he gave a welcome. And he shared that the year prior, the then bishop of the Diocese of Massachusetts welcomed everyone and shared an apology for the ways in which God had been misrepresented to the trans community. It was a powerful moment. I remember being really very moved by that. And Ian referenced that. And then he wrote about his experience and then shared what he actually had to say. As people took their seats and began to settle in for the start of the evening, I sat off to the side, collecting my thoughts. Scheduled to give the welcome with Bishop Shaw on behalf of the cathedral, I could feel the nervous tension intensifying. Katie Ernst, the Crossings Minister for Mission and liaison to the TDOR committee, came over to try to calm me. I was feeling something more than the usual adrenaline rush and nervous butterflies. Was it just that this was the first time I would speak at the cathedral? Was it that this was the first time I would speak to the Boston trans community? Yes and yes, but there was something more. Two of my worlds were meeting that night. It felt a little like inviting your friends and family to the same holiday event, where you are hoping for more than mere toleration. You are hoping that the two groups might actually enjoy their time together. I am grateful that there are many who quite literally embody in our lives both these worlds. I do not stand alone. Still, being Christian in the trans community or being trans in the Christian community has its moments of incongruity. The hurt to many in the trans community in the name of institutional religion, particularly some Christian churches, looms large. There is much work to be done. I am grateful that my own Episcopal Church is a supportive ally and continues to counter voice to the hurt. Oh, Ian. And then I'll just skip. And then it was my turn to speak. I walked up, took the microphone, and turned around. All of a sudden, facing the people, the cathedral had just become much bigger than the view from the seats. These were my remarks. Hello, my name is Ian Stanford. It is my pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of the Cathedral Church of St. Paul and especially on behalf of the Crossing community. We are one of several communities that the cathedral calls home. I feel particularly blessed tonight to have two of my worlds come together, the Episcopal Church and the trans community. 2 years ago, having just begun my own transition, I sat right over there in those seats for the first Trans Day of Remembrance held here at St. Paul's. I listened intently to Bishop Shaw as he apologized for the way Christians, and especially institutional churches, had treated trans people. As I listened to his words, my eyes filled with tears, as did those of the people around me. It was a powerful moment, and for many a healing one. It lingers still in my heart today. Thank you, Tom. And then he goes on. So I just wanted to lift up that coming together of worlds. Ian's was a Christian and trans confluence and an Episcopal one, but there's various versions of that in this room, and it can be hard to hold, and it can be amazing when it's held well. So what might we do from that spaces of confluence to take the power of that and then share it out in a world that is pressing down on all of us, whether we're trans or not, and is using trans people as part of that process. Sorry to toss it.
You don't expect me to answer that, do you? Here, have a mic.
I get to follow it. All right. No. That was great, and I appreciate you sharing, because I think that the combination of worlds is very possible, and it has been possible for a great many people. And I also, going back to what you were sharing about having to deal with like being trans and having other issues or things that you have to like maneuver the world with. I think the other thing about that kind of combination, that coming together, allows us to not draw such firm like fences around identity. I think for a lot of folks, like how to engage with the trans community feels very trans forward, right? And the way that you engage with the trans community is the way that you engage with any community with humanity first. There might be some different things that need to be done, acknowledgement of making sure that you're addressing people correctly, the acknowledgement of different just kind of experiences around gender and around their own journey and process with living as who they are in whatever body they want that to be. But that doesn't mean that trans folks always need to have like their trans identity be first. Having it be recognized and acknowledged and welcomed is important and great, and something to make sure that is being done, but doesn't have to be the sole focus. We at the Pride Center, we work with mental health clinics a lot, and one of the things that I always encourage the clinicians that I'm working with to keep in mind is you might have somebody coming into the room who has anxiety because they are trans. You also might have a trans person coming in who has anxiety. Like those two things don't have to be together all the time. And it can sometimes feel really daunting, I'm sure, to listen to folks be like, this is the trans community needs help in this way. It is like overrepresented in all of these negative ways. And one of the like easy first steps to start coming to help heal that is meeting people with humanity first, which is our jobs in this room, and that helps kind of start to combine all of what we sometimes think of as disparate identities into whole and complete identities. You ready?
Maybe. Yes, I guess is the answer. So I immediately go to the places of where do we provide pastoral care? And you've nailed it, right? In that place of providing pastoral care to trans folks may be about their transness, or it may be about other things happening in their lives, and we can't ignore the transness, but we shouldn't focus on it either unless we're invited in to focus on it. So keeping a very, a friend of mine and I affectionately call it six-dimensional chess. Right, like keeping that multi-dimensional chessboard in mind, and knowing that when you move one piece, all the other pieces get impacted by that, but not assuming that the piece that's presenting in front of us is the ultimate piece that we need to focus on, is, I think, really important. Read my chapter for more on that. But also just remembering that we're all complex people, and at the base of pastoral care is bearing witness. So if we can just be fully present to the complexity of what the people need, we're doing right by them, at least in the beginning. And then as we get to know them and they get to know us, we can go deeper and further into that complexity as it's appropriate to the setting and the needs. And that, is true for both trans and cis folk. I love that we've known each other long enough to read the body language.
Barb and I think first met in about 2007. Is this? It might have been earlier. Yeah, at Trans Religious Leaders Summit at PSR. It's been a long time.
Can we just the number of people in the room at the time was, I think, smaller than the number of people in the room right now. Right.
It was remarkable to be together with other religious leaders across faith traditions who were trans. Like, wow. Yes. It strikes me in thinking about what we've been sharing is that there are pieces that are what can we do within our context, within our faith communal context, to create spaces of genuine welcome, recognition, respect. And then there's also this question of how can we come together and lift up our voices and using our collective power to push back against the horrible rhetoric and the legislation and the various tactics that are targeting trans folks. And it is happening in California. We are a blue state, and we are a blue dot within a relatively blue state, but we're in varied contexts and varied communities, and even in the Bay Area, there's been incidents. And I know one that I'm aware of, because I just last night was reading in the paper about it, is what's going on at San Jose State with the volleyball team. And I'm horrified by what's happening there. A captain has joined a lawsuit trying to change the NCAA's rules about allowing trans women to participate in women's sports. And there have been do you all know what I'm talking about? Yeah, some of you do, maybe not. There have been teams who are refusing to play against them, have been forfeiting as part of an effort to undermine this team and a particular trans player on the team. I just can't even tell you how upset this makes me. There are variations on this theme going on across our country. There are book bans that are going on. There have been efforts within school boards. And even within our Bay Area, we've had at least one. I'm trying to remember, was it Pinole? No, where is it? Within the last year. I'm looking at you because I feel like you might be a little more aware. But I'll just, because I want to hear what insight and perspective you have on this. I don't know if there might be opportunities for opportunities to push back against such efforts, specifically as faith leaders. There's something powerful about countering the religious anti-trans trend. And are there opportunities for us to do that? What might that look like? So that's a question I wonder about, and I don't know specific opportunities, and I don't know what work would be important to do prior to taking a more public pressing. There's the internal and the external facing work. So I wanted to just lift up my observation of where we are in our equipping and lift up the possibility that there could be an opportunity. What might that look like? And please share, Ishani.
I don't have an immediate answer, unfortunately, but I have some small ideas. I think what you were talking about with middle schools, I have a vague memory of actually currently, because I was in a meeting last night with a unified school district. I won't name this district or the school because this is something that parents are really causing more of a fuss about. But very briefly, Gavin Newsom recently signed a law about gender neutral restroom access for schools. And there is a local middle school that is fighting to install multi-stall gendered restrooms, and they are being absolutely lambasted for it. Parents are up in arms. And the intent is simply to give more than one option to trans and non-binary kids to be able to pee, because right now most of the time it's a single stall room that's over in the staff area. And so then there's a concern there of if you're constantly disappearing to the staff area, you might be outing yourself to other students who are aware. So there's just kind of constant ongoing issues, even locally in the Bay Area. And I think one of the really good opportunities, and this can also tie back into kind of making sure that there's not strong lines between being trans and being a person of faith, building community with queer community, queer support centers, things like that. Obviously, the San Mateo County Pride Center and the Peninsula Solidarity Cohort are already close, but there's also Coast Pride over in Half Moon Bay. We work with a handful, our partners at Outlet who do youth services. We work with other orgs within Santa Clara County as well. And one of the reasons that learning about local queer resources and centers is really valuable, they can promote you all and the fact that there are inclusive and accessible faith communities for their queer members. And it allows you to support folks who might be in your congregations as their faith leader and connect them to community so that you don't feel like you have to hold all the pieces of this person is struggling with their identity, not just their faith identity, but maybe their gender identity. I don't know what to do about that second half. Connection, reaching out to communities, adding your voice to the work that especially Pride centers are doing, but just in general, being visible is a really, really good first step because again, as I've mentioned to death, there is a narrative that isn't really an option, right? That religion and queerness need to stay separate. And we all know from experience that's not true. And being loud about it is very important. Making sure that folks who, like myself, who work at Pride Centers, who work with community members who are asking for faith resources, know who you are, where you are, what you practice in order for folks to be connected, to be able to refer community members to different resources that might be supportive of their queer identity while still giving them a faith resource. And that allows for coalition building, to increase our ability to not only support our queer community members, but also to be louder about the fact that not all faiths, not all religions actually have this view. It's just the few, but the loud, and the majority can start to be louder about that.
You want me? So I just, I'm thinking about a trans young person that I'm close to, and when you were describing the bathroom situations, oftentimes a gender-neutral restroom might be, or a gender-neutral change room for like gym might be like a slightly converted closet, not like with mops in it. Like it might not be a very inviting place to change, and it might actually mean that the young person opts out of doing regular PE and does like a separate PE, which this young person I know who is very athletically gifted is in fact doing. And or this young person may hold it for the day, even though they could access it because it's just so inconvenient for the kinds of reasons that you say, which can lead to like a UTI, among other problems. Like there's sort of day-to-day, it just makes me enraged, to be perfectly honest. When you think about the rhetoric that's being directed at our young people, and they're just trying to kind of have a middle school or a high school life, a day-to-day life, not making a big thing, really wanting to not make a big splash, but like there are these little barriers that are actually really big barriers that actually can have health impacts. And they're amazing, creative, powerful young people. And I'm imagining we know such folk in this room. So what can we do to like fiercely support them? That's just a question that burns in my heart, I have to say.
And added to that, I think, particularly around bathrooms and changing areas, this is a place where queer advocacy, trans-specific advocacy, and disability accessibility naturally connects, right? And we often get kind of into the habit of thinking this silo, this silo, this silo, and the needs of somebody with mobility challenges to have a spacious enough bathing or bathroom or changing facility, and the need for a trans or gender queer person to have that same thing, it's the same need. And rather than ask folks in a school setting to say, create the gender bathroom, create the accessibility bathroom, right? We all benefit from having more of these facilities that meet more needs. So in answer to your question of what can we do, one of it is look for the places in your communities where the overlap is a more natural thing and proactively reach out to both communities.
I think also along the lines of what we can do, listen to trans people and their experiences, and take them with as much value as the, frankly, disinformation that is out there. I think, one of the other big things about the rhetoric, right, is like, frankly, full stop, a lot of it is lies. The idea that kids are getting surgeries during a school day is insane, but people repeat that, right? It's like your child might come home having gotten a gender surgery. That is literally it has never happened, it's never going to happen, right?
It's simply not possible.
There is not time. And the kind of the rhetoric around, especially for youth, but also very much for adults. Youth are very much targeted, but adults are definitely not like in a safe zone, right? Just having a better understanding of what gender affirming care is and how it applies to everyone, right, is really valuable. For example, something that gets brought up a lot is the idea of like puberty blockers. They're so terrible. We give them to these trans kids. It's awful. We give them to cis kids too. Kids who are not trans also get gender affirming care in a variety of ways. And a lot of folks, I'll get off my soapbox in a second, but a lot of folks who are I recently went through this with a close family member, he was very staunchly like, we're providing all of these surgeries to these young kids, and then at the same time was like, oh, but if a girl gets a nose job at 17, that's a different thing entirely. Is it? Or have you been told that it is? And that's really the like kind of boiling down to what we can do. Examine if there are certain things that are coming up, examine sources, offer alternative information, ideally factual information, and frankly, trust trans people. A lot of, I think, issues that trans kids and trans adults run into sometimes is their stories are taken as stories, not as factual experiences, right? So they'll share something about their transition and then they'll get pushback of, oh, well, that was probably just you. I heard this happens for everybody else. Except you're getting that lived experience from somebody, and that should be held with as much value as whatever a politician said on TV. And I think starting to adjust how much value we place in, not to say that we place a lot of value in certain political rhetoric, but how much value we place in like people's authenticity needs to be paid enough attention to so that trans folks are able to be experts in their own experiences and able to share and know they're going to be believed and heard and understood, as opposed to, I have to fight to prove that this thing I said is true because there's a louder voice saying false things.
And I think thinking about the use of social media, right, particularly, you may not be quick to spread the disinformation, but inevitably it's coming across all of our feeds. So as you have the capacity, being a voice to say, this source of this is inaccurate, or this piece of information is inaccurate, and not waiting just for the trans folk to be the ones to say that. Sure. No, I was going to shift the topic a little bit, so if you want to respond to that.
Mine might be slightly shifty.
Perfect.
So
All right, well, I'll shift first then. I love it. As somebody who started an organization of trans religious professionals within my own denomination, I just wanted to lift up and encourage you to, I'm going to say at least 90% of the denominations and institutional religious bodies represented in this room, beyond just your local congregation, probably have a trans, if not clergy, a trans religious professionals organization. You may or may not know about it yet, but it's there, right? The organization I started is about to celebrate its 20th year, which is amazing. And I just name that to say, like, it doesn't matter if you're a member of the organization or not, trans or not. These are grassroots organizations that need support and help. So reaching out to your specific denomination or religious bodies group, sometimes just with I'm so glad you're there, please don't hesitate to reach out if there's ever anything I can do to support you, right? It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. Having served in leadership, like, it means the world to have particularly cis religious leaders within the denomination saying that. So again, on the list of concrete things you can do, that's one of them. And if you have, professional expenses or funds that you can give to the organization, even better. But it can be as simple as an email or a postcard, depending on, electronic or not electronic.
Yes, and in my tradition, the Episcopal Church, we do have Trans Episcopal, which is also about to have a 20th kind of anniversary. Come to think of it, hadn't thought of it. Totally all volunteers, scrappy as all get out. But yeah, no, we've existed for almost 20 years, which is kind of amazing to think of.
Those are just the official dates, like the groups existed before that.
Yeah. People getting together and figuring out what needs to be done and being strategic and using our collective power to engage and transform and authentically connect. I mean, that's what I was gonna say a little earlier. I think does actually loop back around to this, in that way of authentic connection. I was thinking about the earlier part of our conversation about young folks in particular, and I think there's all this rhetoric we've been referencing, and there's also a lot of anxiety about young trans and non-binary folk, and I think within supportive groups there can be anxiety about that. And what I want to say is our support for young trans and non-binary folk should, I think, come from a place of respecting their processes of discernment. I'm using a word from within my particular tradition, spiritual discernment, which is a word I might use to express how is God making God's self known in my life or in the life of the person I'm interacting with. We might think about trans and non-binary folk as in their process of coming into themselves in all of its dimensions, not only gender. They are discerning who they're being called to be and become. And that's a process they're engaging with in their own hearts and souls and with the people closest to them, including their friends and potentially their parents. And all of them together are in a process that we might think of perhaps as discernment. And so my thought about that is to respect that discernment is going on. But so much of the rhetoric precisely does not do that. It presumes to know what is or can or cannot be possible. It does not respect their discernment. They're doing that with their providers as well. In different contexts, they may have more or less access to supportive providers, but all of them together are doing very careful discernment. The anxious generated rhetoric and the rhetoric that exploits that anxiety does not recognize that. So I just wanted to kind of offer that as a perspective in our own not knowingness about what may be going on for any young person in our lives. It just respecting the discernment. And then the other thing I wanted to just lift up was that as part of that discernment, they're recognizing that trans folks have a variety of different experiences in the world because we don't all carry the same levels of privilege. I carry a ton of privilege as somebody who is a trans man. I am not entirely binary in how I understand myself, but I use he, him. I am treated in an entirely binary way in the world. I am treated as straight, regardless of the fact that I identify as queer because I'm married to a woman and I have 2 kids. And I carry class privilege. I carry I have a lot of levels of privilege. Not all trans people carry that. There's intersectionality here. You're a person of color. You're a person of a different socioeconomic class. You disability. All sorts of ways that that intersectionality plays into the experience of trans folks. And as they're discerning, they're thinking about what's going to play out in their lives. That's part of their discernment. I've had a conversation with a young person who's trans femme and who said, oh my goodness, your experience in the world might be rather different than mine, not in precisely those words. And I was like, I don't know, but yeah. And I can't say that you're going to have the same kind of experience as mine, and we had to sit with that, and that's painful. So I just want to recognize that there's lots of variables in here, and respecting that discernment also means respecting the difficulties and the possibilities in all of their complexity that may come to unfold. So that's part of our support, whatever awareness we can cultivate around that.
And I'll add, not just the young people. All the people. I had a patient who, a presumed heterosexual couple, and the wife was one of my hospice patients and died just a couple of weeks ago. And her spouse, upon my reaching out to give condolences, said, it's a really complicated thing right now. I'm coming out as trans, and she supported me, but I waited until after she died to do this. And is now figuring out what it means to have been a cis male in the world and coming out as a woman, figuring out how to be the feminist that they want to be.
Yeah, I really appreciate the conversation about discernment. And one of the things that I also want to highlight about that, right? It's hard to know who you are if that's never recognized or reflected back to you. And yes, absolutely, trans youth and adults will sometimes go through a transition process that can be bumpy. It can take U-turns, it can take left turns, right turns. But part of that process is being heard, seen, understood, reflected, and then realizing these things fit, but these things don't. And I think that you're right, the kind of anxiety that gets whipped up around this actually does a lot of harm, and then it does the harm of some trans people then are forced to learn who they are and transition in a silo by themselves, and it's so much harder to be authentically you without people who are willing and able to kind of recognize who you are at this point in your journey, regardless of who you're going to become down the road. And then I also want to touch on the intersection piece, because I think that's really important. Acknowledging expansion and difference in gender identity, gender expression, gender presentation, experience, all of that is very valuable and important to the trans community, and is also very valuable and important to all of us. Cis folks don't have the same gender as each other in the same way that trans folks have a variety of gendered experiences, and being more open about how gender shows up for everybody regardless of their specific identity is helpful for reproductive rights. It's more inclusive of cultural practices, where especially in the Bay Area there's a lot of indigenous folks who have a history of their gender diversity being erased from their communities, and starting to open that up again helps us create more dialogue with multiple marginalized communities, not just trans folks. Inclusivity in one area fosters inclusivity in the others. And I think that for trans people, it is both extremely helpful for the community specifically, and then also that spreads out to everybody else in your congregations and in your personal lives, and how you kind of interact with the world and yourselves. I'm going to pass it back, but we're also getting...
A couple more minutes and then we'll go to questions?
Yes.
Okay, great.
A couple more minutes and then we'll go for questions. Great idea. I'm going to shift it a little bit again and just say one of the weird experiences I had coming out, and I came out in the early 90s. I was working for my denomination's headquarters at the time, so it's been a very public coming out for me. And one of the challenges, particularly back then, but I see us doing this with our youngsters too, is I got put on a pedestal really quickly. Right, so quickly, of like, I am both the model of transness and also I'm brilliant. Now at 53, I can say, yes, I'm brilliant. But it took me a long time to figure out what was really me in terms of my skill set as a leader and what was just handed to me on that pedestal. And I name this to just say, be cautious but generous as you're nurturing and fostering young trans folk into their being. We want to both be supportive and also real. So if they've got problematic aspects to who they are, they're not a great leader and need more skills. Help them get those skills, right? They haven't quite matured to differentiating between themselves and those around them. Help them do that. Don't just let folks, like we would with anybody else, I hope, right? Help set boundaries and grow leaders into mature human beings. All right, I'm done.
I have nothing to add to that.
Neither.
All right, well then we'll do Q&A.
That was a brilliant segue. So thank you so much, and we'll take time at the end to really thank our panelists. But this is a continuation. Let me move up a little bit so I can see you all. And I just want to first say also a big thank you to Tovis for putting this panel together. And as we go into the question and answer time, I just want to remind us that this is a space of authenticity, a space of safety, and you don't have to get it right. They've welcomed us, right? Each of them. Specifically, you don't have to get everything right. So just ask questions that I don't know about you, but I've been extremely moved. I've been working with the trans community since 1993, and I've learned things today. And you're Cameron, you're using pronouns as a theology. was so, like, I will just be thinking about that for weeks, about the mystery of the human person. I guess you're brilliant too. And you are brilliant. I know, right? You're all brilliant. It's crazy. Yeah. Remember that pedestal? Just got higher. All right. Okay, great. Okay, so here's what I'd love to do. Chuck, are you going to be able to hear people if they, because it's really hard to pass this around. Okay, if you have, we really want to capture this. For people that weren't able to be here, I think a lot of incredible wisdom and truth has been shared. So we want to make sure that your questions are heard as well. So if you have a question, would you raise your hand and we will get you the mic. Okay, Mary and then Joshua. You might have to maybe come up. How about that? And then just hand it up.
At the risk of asking a very ignorant question, I just found at the very beginning when Shani was talking about those that believe, sex determined at birth as opposed to internal, just to define trans. I mean, how would you define it, and how would you define it?
So I can give you like the scientific, and then if we want to dive into it. So prefix trans literally means out of alignment with or the entire word transgender, out of alignment or away from sex assigned at birth. So does not identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth is trans. We'll pause and caveat, there's an interesting community generational conversation happening about if being non-binary is the same as being trans, which is why you'll hear some people say, I do it too, trans and non-binary. That's a much more in the weeds, complicated conversation. But in general, the trans umbrella captures folks who do not identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Cis, C-I-S, if you've never seen it written, in alignment with, same side of. And those are people who do identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. As a quick, very brief, underwriting to that, the trans community has done a lot of work right around separating gender and biological sex. Biological sex is thought of as a binary. You can only be male or female. High school bio, as well as just life in general, teaches us that that's not true. And there is also a community, the intersex community, that is actually even more kind of oppressed and overlooked than the trans community. And there's also a reversal of issues going on. The intersex community generally is forced to go through conforming surgeries that they do not know about or consent to, and trans folks cannot get medical care that they are seeking. So that's an ongoing conversation that both communities are having. But yes, the definition of trans is just somebody who does not identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth.
Brilliant.
That's why they pay me the nonprofit dollars.
If you would allow me 30 seconds, I'd like to tell you a story, and then my question will come from that. I have a daughter who's trans, and her coming out process has been, we've let her take the lead on how that would come to fruition for her. And when a couple years ago, when she finally came out to the wider family, I, of course, was apprehensive about this. We have many different people in our family who are, and inevitably, as one of the parents, I was expecting the questions that would come with that, right? And I don't believe that the questions that I'm sure we've all know come are malicious. They just don't come from a place of, they just haven't been in it long enough to really know that they were inappropriate, But when this happened and my daughter finally came out, my brother, I have an identical twin brother, who's also a pastor, funny enough, he immediately FaceTimed my entire family, and he acted as the buffer between my family going through doing our thing, right? And those questions. And he took on that, and was able to field the things, knowing that I'm very close to this, and he could maybe act a little more objectively and answer the questions a little more like, hey, we shouldn't be asking those questions because that's not really appropriate, and if you don't use her pronouns right, we might let you slide once, but we'll just gently remind you and know that it's not us trying to be mean, like kind of things like that. And so here's my question. Sorry. Sorry. Here's my question. As a pastor, as a person who leads a faith community, we have, most people in my congregation are not trans. I wonder, is there any ways in which, any suggestions, any resources, how pastors could act like my brother acted, is as a way to help kind of buffer the family from those questions, because they're already dealing with a lot, right? They're already dealing. That's my question.
All right, I took the last one, so I'll pass it off.
All right, apparently it's my turn. On a very concrete, simple level, right, it would be letting I would start with the queer subgroups within your congregation know, but let it ripple out, or, use whatever communication tools you have in the congregation to very specifically say, if a family member is coming out, come talk with me. I'm willing to, and then list concretely what you're willing to do, right? I'm willing to be an advocate. I'm willing to be a buffer. I'm here to support you. And then just proactively reach out as you hear people coming out. You hear congregations are gossip places, right? Like our communities are just that. So let the gossip happen that you are the person to go to when folks are coming out to their families.
Yes, I've definitely, well, also thank you for sharing that, and thank you for supporting your daughter. Sorry. It matters. So yeah, we can do that, and it helps to have buffers, and we can be those buffers. And I have been actually before, as I think about it. I've talked with, I'm thinking about a family who had a younger family member who was discerning around transitioning, and I've been kind of a buffer in a place where questions could be brought that they might not want to ask the person directly. I think we can do that. We can make ourselves available. I'm also thinking, like, in my congregation, we recently did like a trans pronoun 101 session where I kind of shared some of what I said in that section. And I made it clear people could come to me and to the other presenter. We've done it. We did 2 sessions of it. With questions, including like not in front of the whole group, because sometimes people just don't feel comfortable, and that's okay too, to asking what they just don't even know if they have the right words to ask the question. And yeah, this isn't about shaming people. It's about all of us coming together and in support and equipping one another in community. So I think we can. I don't have more concrete examples, but yeah, I think it's such a great scenario.
I'll add before I hand it over to you. The other thing that we can do as religious leaders in communities is proactively do those educational moments, right? Whether it's us leading, you leading, or bringing in somebody to leave. I hear there's this great community center nearby. Just saying. But sponsoring, right? There are some other organizations that are online, but creating the spaces where that education can happen in your congregation, and then making sure that you have it in your schedule to attend, right? Not just getting it to happen, but being there and modeling for your community that you are willing to engage in this educational process, that you are there to be supportive. That plants the seed so that when a family member has somebody coming out, they already know that you're a safe person to come to.
Yeah, I think in terms too of acting as like a buffer, as that person who might be like the immediate, I have so many questions about what's happening, I need to ask somebody. There's a couple of key things to keep in mind. One, for me, when people are like, I have questions about somebody who's trans, I think the base level to pay attention to are these questions about this person, this individual, or are they specifically about being trans? Because those are different, right? If the question is, your daughter just came out, that's so wonderful. How do you know how long she's been like thinking about this? Do you know if there's anything she's struggling with that we can work to support her? Like, does she really want pronouns? Is she really trying to find a name? Those are questions about her experience. If the response is, is she gonna start getting surgeries? Is she gonna start like doing hormones and stuff? That's medical information that frankly people don't need. So being willing to recognize when the questions cross a boundary and say, that is a question. There are resources online to learn about trans experiences, but this person's specific journey is not necessarily your business, or in a kinder way. I think self-education is also a really big key, right? I think a lot of folks struggle to be a buffer because they don't have the answers. And there's two things about that. One, there's no universal answer. Again, I do training and education, and I tell everybody at the beginning of a training, a lot of times the questions that you all are gonna have, the answer is simply gonna be, it depends on the person. There's no like actual universal, but there are some things that you can know, right? You can know best practices for like figuring out how to use new pronouns. You can know generally what does and does not happen around transitioning, especially for kids. And online, there's a lot of resources. GLSEN is a great one that focuses on K through 12. The Trevor Project is also under 18. HRC has like a huge glossary. And then there are local organizations, the Pride Center, obviously. We are doing free community trainings. So we have a whole training library, and every fiscal year, each training will be offered for free one time. We have a Pronouns 101 coming up on November 12th, which is a Tuesday, from 6 to 7:30 p.m. via Zoom. It's gonna be all about pronouns. What are they? Why are they important? How do we use them? How do we practice them? Things like that. So paying attention to what like local pride orgs are putting out to help educate so that you can answer those questions when they come up, because a lot of times it's difficult to be that buffer person if you're constantly being like, well, I don't know, I'm not sure. And then all of that being said, you don't have to know everything. You can be the buffer without having all of the answers, and sometimes saying, that's a really good question, and I'm gonna come back to you once I learn more and am able to reflect more, and you can also look at these resources to learn more yourself. Because I think the big thing, right, about what your brother did was take off the onus on you and your daughter to like answer all the very basic questions that folks have, which is totally legitimate to have, right? People are often trying to understand experiences that are not theirs, and that seeking to understand should be like nurtured and grown and held, and also boundaried so that it doesn't become invasive or like more on a pushback level, right? Hopefully that was helpful.
That was good. Next question.
And about 5 more minutes. Joan.
Can you talk a little bit more about the factors, some of the factors, because I know they're varied, that enter into a person deciding that they're trans? That's part of the discernment.
I'm going to turn the question around on you for a moment and just say, for those of you in the room that are cisgender, how did you know? And I say that because, and I'm going to guess all three of us will give very different answers, but for me, I've never not been trans. Like there was the decision process for me, I didn't come out until my 20s. I didn't come out publicly until my 20s, but not because I didn't know who I was, literally didn't have language. Like for me, it was reading Leslie Feinberg's Transgender Warriors before it was published, because I had the privilege of reading the transcript. So for me, it was, I worked at the Unitarian Universalist Association, and their publishing house was publishing the book. And I got the manuscript from the executive vice president with the question, should we bring her to our General Assembly? And so I read the book because I needed to know. And for the first time in my life, I had language that described my lived experience. The next day I read it all that night because I was like, oh, this is fantastic. And the next day I went into the executive vice president's office and said, yes, of course we should bring the author. I'm so glad we're publishing this book. Oh, by the way, I'm trans. And because I am who I am, which is institutionalist through and through, I said, are there forms I need to fill out? And bless her heart, she responded with, no, would you like me to create some? But for me, like, so I'm not sure how to answer your question other than a little bit of humor because I don't know what it's like not to be trans. There were no factors for me. After I had language, the question was, is it safe? Like, I had already come out as a lesbian, then I'd come out as bi. And so for me, having experienced discrimination in both of those venues or those access points, the question was, will I be safe? Will I be employable? Will I have physical safety? And while that was 30 years ago, those are still some of the questions that people coming out today in all of the access points think about.
My experience kind of echoes yours a little bit, right? Like, looking back, I was always a queer trans kid, like, without a doubt. I didn't have community or language. I came out as queer in high school and as trans in college because I went to the LGBTQ center and they started introducing themselves with their names and their pronouns. And I was like, what the hell is a pronoun? And then I started looking into it and I was like, oh, and everything kind of clicked into place. And I'll be honest with you, I, for a while, was trying to convince myself that I was a trans man, and I was like deeply struggling with that. And it wasn't until my senior year where I was like, I can just be non-binary. This doesn't have to be like a transition, identity in my trans journey, right? But I think that like not everybody will say that, right? Not everybody's like, I've always been trans. But one of the things to keep in mind when folks are coming out, very rarely are they coming out to themselves at the same time that they're coming out to other people? In the trans community, we call it egg cracking. Usually the egg is cracked well before other folks know about it. And that's important because for them, the train has left the station. They had the realization, whatever that point was, at whatever age it was, that something would have clicked, something that has not been quite right has suddenly been clarified about what exactly that is, and they've kind of done the internal process to figure out, does this fit for me? Is this journey that I'm about to go on the one that I actually want to go on? And there's a lot of anxiety around that, right? One of my dad's first questions to me when I came out to him was, are you going to be able to have a relationship? And I was like, that's valid, but you're getting that from like just general fear instead of understanding that I'm more likely now because I actually have like a sense of peace in who I am instead of constantly struggling against it. And I think that the question, how did you know when you were cis, is actually a very, very apt one, because one of the things that I see a lot blurring when I do trainings for folks is a lot of people will get like specific messages about who they are supposed to be because of their gender. We all do. I should caveat. Not a lot of people, everybody, right? And I think a lot about like the phrase tomboy. I was a tomboy growing up and I was very comfortable in that identity. And then I hit puberty and then I was like no longer really allowed to be a tomboy. But that gender bendiness exists in a lot of people who are also cis. It just doesn't fully cross into being trans. And I think a lot of people are wondering where that line is, and it's all internal. Like there's no, everybody's got a different response, right? There's no 100% like this is the thing that determines you as trans. You are trans if the gender or sex that you were assigned at birth does not fit you. And for some people, it very acutely does not fit them in like specific ways. And for some people, it's just like wearing too small shoes. It's always kind of there and you can live with it, but it's not quite right until you discover something that fits.
I resonate so much with what you both of you just shared. Also, the egg cracky and the egg language. I mean, we're having a generational moment here because I hadn't heard the language around egg and egg cracking until maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And I was like, what is that? Yeah, no. And it was a young person coming out to me, and anyway, and I just like, wow, okay, I'm feeling old now, and I didn't know that I needed to. You just learned it. I love it. I too was quite a tomboy as a child, and grew up in the free to be you and me era in the East Bay, and like I resonate with that sense of like where's the line that you were just lifting up, Ishani, and I could just say around discernment, I figuring out where I was in the gender nonconformity of that and where I was called. It felt to me like as part of my vocation is to be fully embodied in myself and in my sense of spirit alignment. And there was just a period, what I came to over time was a sense that gender is much more expansive than a binary. And I came out a little later than you, Barb, but it was in the 90s that I was coming out to myself, and Leslie Feinberg's book, Transgender Warriors, was actually a pretty big part of it for me as well. And part of it was Feinberg's commitment to the expansion of gender. And it just creates more freedom for people to be wherever they may happen to be. And so for me, as someone who's transmasculine, it is, and I can make my way through a binary world, and that's part of the privilege I referenced earlier, but I don't experience myself as entirely binary, though I wouldn't say I'm non-binary. I don't quite resonate with that term, but if there's this sense of a fluidity of gender as a body of water and there's land, I have a foot in the water and a foot on the land. And that's been true for me all the way through, and it may or may not be that visible in how I make my way in the world, it's been true since I was a child, and I've gotten pushback for it as a child and especially as an adolescent. And so I'm incredibly grateful to be able to inhabit my gender in a way in which I'm at peace. And I'm really grateful for folks in the community who have been pushing on gender and its oppressive hierarchical formations coming out of the feminist community, queer community. All of these are integral to my journey, and my faith tradition has been absolutely integral to that as well. And so coming to a place where I could not feel that I had to do the either or thing was just absolutely crucial for me in being able to accept what was long true. I did a lot of work. I had a whole year of spiritual direction focused on this question too. I could go on, but I won't.
Another question.
Can I just very briefly offer two quick follow-up resources around this? Will and Harper is a movie documentary that just came out on Netflix. Will Ferrell and his friend Harper Steele. She came out late in life, and I think a lot of what she says, especially at the beginning of the movie, around her experience up until I think she was in her mid-50s when she came out and started transitioning, resonated for me, having had a different experience, and I think she articulates some really valuable things. The other thing, very briefly, Judith Butler, who is another very well-known. They just released a book called Who's Afraid of Gender, which talks about gender as just a large societal construct that impacts all of us, and how trans folks are kind of the anxiety, especially around knowing that you're trans or not, is very much a focal point to continue to implement certain gender constrictions and expectations universally. So Will and Harper and Who's Afraid of Gender by Judith Butler, I would recommend for trans stories as well.
And Judith Butler was on a podcast recently about the book that was really, really good. If you don't read the whole book, you can at least search her on podcast. Rabbi Rebecca, I'm going to invite you to come up and you can ask your question up here. And I know. But I want, as Rabbi comes, we're just about out of time. Is it a quick one, Jim?
It's a quick one. It's a quick invitation for other members of the Peninsula Gay Coalition to see how we can bring these issues, maybe these speakers, to one of those meetings, because it feels like a frontier space for us. We seem unable to talk about LGBT or especially transgender issues there, and many of us belong to it. So I think it's a frontier possibility.
That's a fabulous idea. If you can make that happen, that would be so great. So here's what I'm going to suggest. One is that I hope you all can stay for lunch. I don't know if that's in your schedules or not. I want to put you on the spot, but it's really good food, which is really the only reason they come, because we have really good lunches. So, and I'm going to invite you to sit at different tables so that people can. Okay, great. And
Should I ask my question then if we're running short on time?
okay, that's great. And so I want to leave us with a question, and then before we thank them, Rabbi Rebecca's going to give us a blessing and a closing prayer. But I want to leave us with this this question that one of our panelists said, and the question is, what can we do to fiercely support the trans community? And I love that. Not just support, not just, affirm, fiercely support. And I want to leave us with that in our own communities. I know for a fact that we all could do a little more in supporting and fiercely supporting the trans community. So would you offer your blessing?
And I'm glad you lifted that up, Penny, because the question I hope I can ask one of you at a table is about fierce support. So I'm looking forward to learning some more at my table, and also just so excited to hear about egg cracking, because when I was looking through some of the really fabulous range of Jewish trans liturgy that has been blossoming in the last few decades, including a lot of work in non-binary Hebrew, which I have had the opportunity to use in weddings several times, which is really special. There was a blessing for somebody you suspect might not be quite yet ready to crack an egg. So I just saw that yesterday, so that brought a big smile to my face, but that's not the blessing I'm going to give today, although I'm happy to share it. I wanted to share, I adapted this from Rabbi Emily Aviva Kapoor-Mater, who wrote a blessing that really spoke, I think, to what we've all had the opportunity to learn today. And the way that she shares it is, may we be blessed on our journeys as we each walk through this world. May the source of life bless the holy assembly of all trans people and all who cross over the boundaries of life. Grant all life and happiness and an abundance of blessings, and spread over all a shelter of peace. Grant all the strength to create and to be created, to form and to be formed, to love all creation and to pursue peace. And to that I want to add, may we all know and learn and teach truth and justice, and may we all know wholeness.
Amen and amen. Yes. So could we, from our hearts, really thank our panelists today? Yeah, absolutely.